Welcome to the Visceral Voice Podcast. I'm your host, Christine Schneider. Every 2 weeks on this podcast, I talk with voice specialists, manual therapists, health specialists, psychotherapists, movement practitioners, and professional voice users about voice science, function, medication, movement, puberty and aging, and everything in between. I am on a quest, not only to become a better manual therapist, but also to learn everything I can about the living, breathing body and its intricate connection to the voice. This podcast documents the continuation of my learning and my experience as a professional singer, a nutritional consultant, and a manual therapist. Join me every 2 weeks as we strive to provide current, knowledgeable, creative, and compassionate information to help restore, regain, and create happiness and success in your vocal journey. Hi, everyone. In this episode, I have a conversation with Jared Trudeau. Jared is a voice teacher in New York City. He has his MFA in voice pedagogy for musical theater from Penn State University, the first and only program of its kind. Prior to his work at Penn State, Jared received degrees in music and psychology from Tufts University, graduating summa cum laude and receiving highest thesis honors for his work entitled Belting Beauties and Soaring Sopranos, Voice Pedagogy to Address the Wide-Ranging Needs of Women in Musical Theater. In addition to his New York studio, Jared holds a position as an assistant professor of voice at the Boston Conservatory, where he teaches both undergraduate and graduate students. He has also served on the faculties of Penn State and Cap 21 Malloy College. Here you are, my conversation with Jared Trudeau. Hi, Jared. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so stoked to have you here. Jared's a good friend of mine, and he is now an assistant professor of voice at the Boston Conservatory, as well as having a private practice in New York City. So thank you for joining me, chatting about the male and female voice.
You're so welcome.
So let's start with just kind of telling us how you got into teaching voice.
I've been teaching voice, I've unofficially been teaching voice for a super long time because I played the piano really well. And I had a lot of friends growing up in high school who just liked to sing. So I would sit and play and say, hey, why don't you try this instead? And they listened to me, which was great. And I was able to music direct a whole lot. And then I went to Tufts University to become a doctor. Yeah. So I did the pre-med sequence, and then I shadowed close family friends of ours who are doctors, and I spent a couple weeks in the hospital. And at the end of that, I was sitting in Dr. Erica Kesselman's office, and she points to her walls at all the fancy pieces of paper on her walls and says, so these were my 20s and early 30s. That's what it's going to be if you become a doctor. And I don't see your heart sing when you talk about medicine the same way that it does about music or anything else, which then kind of threw me into a spiral of, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? But I was still singing that whole time. And I wound up deciding to not apply to medical school. And I got degrees in music and psychology. And I wrote a super long honors thesis on vocal pedagogy for women in musical theater, which then through doing the research for that, I met Mary Saunders Barton, who is just one of the most inspiring humans in the world. And she is like the grandmother of musical theater voice pedagogy. Maybe not grandmother. That's not the... Yeah, anywho. But she was there at the beginning, at the forefront, and everybody knows who she is. And she was kind enough to do an interview with me. And I sent her a copy of my thesis, and she had really kind words about it. And fast forward, she had this MFA program in voice pedagogy for musical theater at Penn State, and somebody had left the program, so there was an opening, and they invited me and a few other people to come audition for it. I prepared an audition and spent a whole day there. It was really, really a long process. But then I wound up going there for my MFA in voice pedagogy for musical theater, and I got to really witness what it is to see super talented people training at the highest level with the best possible voice training and being introduced to every aspect of voice training. So pedagogy, anatomy, physiology, experiential anatomy, acoustics, and then acting, dance, movement, voice and speech methodologies. And that kind of is how I created my little hodgepodge that makes up my
Mhm.
pedagogy. And then I graduated from there and went to New York City and had been teaching privately all along. And now I have my private studio there. I worked at Cap 21 for a couple of years, and now I split my time between Boston and New York.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that's like the official start of it. I think it all went back to the fact that my little brother went to speech therapy for a long time when he was a kid because there were just some issues in there, and I got to go with him.
Mhm.
So from the time when I was little, I was playing the games with my brother and his speech therapist, going no and hearing all those kinds of adjustments. I think kind of just primed me to always be listening for that.
I knew all of that about you except for the psychology degree.
Oh yeah, my other degree's in psychology. I really love it. Yeah, so it's really nice. It helps me understand my students better, and it also lets gives me an understanding of when I know what I don't know. So
Mhm.
I don't feel a lot of voice teachers feel like they fall into the trap of also being a therapist, and I know exactly what a therapist does and what they should do, and when I just have to refer out to somebody, and I can be there and support somebody, but there we have to have a lot of people on our team.
Yeah.
And a lot of voice teachers, I think, have a little bit, and it's not in a bad way at all, but have a bit of a like, oh, savior complex because we're all nurturers and we all want to help people, but knowing when we're equipped to do that and when we're not. And
Yeah.
yeah,
Absolutely.
and it also helped with because I did a lot of social psychology and then a lot of neuro, so all of the motor learning theory that now is kind of making its way into voice teaching and voice research. It's been really great because I'm quite literate in that. So when research pops up like that, I'm like, oh, this feels like home.
Yeah. That's fantastic.
Yeah,
Can you talk to us about the differences between the male and female voice?
absolutely. So I'm going to start by saying that there are fewer than we think, and there
Mhm.
are fewer than a lot of people treat them as having,
Mhm.
because we have the same anatomy, we've got the same moving parts. There's just the size difference, but a lot of the coordinations both sets of anatomy can make, the resultant sound will change, and how much time we spend in one mode of vibration or another mode is going to change depending on whether you're male or female. But I think that it's important for all men to really be working that head function, that mode too. And I think it's really important for all women, even if they're never going to sing musical theater or any kind of pop or contemporary styles, to still utilize their chest voice or that mode one production. So it's all about balance, and the balance does wind up being slightly different for men and women, but we're constantly going back and forth in order to keep the instrument healthy. I also think that one of the biggest differences for me, because in my school job, about 2/3 of my studio are undergraduates. So some of the men that I get at 18 years old had a voice change only 2 years prior.
Mhm.
And it's a huge learning curve. Guys are really kind of working with training wheels in some respects until their early 20s because the larynx has changed by such a large amount in terms of size, and the muscles have stretched and cartilages have gotten bigger and thicker and the vocal folds lengthen and thicken. And women go through a change, but it's not quite as intense,
Yeah.
which is why certain things just seem to come faster depending on when that voice change occurred.
Right.
Yeah. Trying to think. I mean, if we're looking at differences for women, if we're talking musical theater singing, but really most kinds of singing, we have two equally commercially viable laryngeal registration options.
Mhm.
There are a lot of sounds that you can make in a head dominant production, and there are a lot of sounds that you can make in a chest dominant production. And there's a lot of interplay, and you're going to spend about equal times in both, probably, or give or take. With men, 95% of our singing that's going to be done in public, not necessarily when we're vocalizing, but done in public, is going to be in mode one. Is going to be something chesty,
Mm.
which I think is probably one of the biggest differences. And it's one of the things that when men are teaching women how to belt, sometimes they'll forget that there are certain things that in chest voice feel like a lot of pressure. And if a woman has never experienced that before, it will take a little while for that coordination to get smooth.
Mhm.
when it's something just totally foreign. And same thing on the flip side, women, if they're training a man in falsetto, head voice for most women, unless there's something, either if there's a pathology or some MTD, muscular tension dysphonia, chances are they can access head voice in some way, in an easier way than it is for some men, particularly men post in the years following their voice change.
Right.
So
And so when you say that the men are predominantly in mode one and predominantly in chest, is that predominantly is that TA dominant then?
yeah, that'd be also TA dominant chest.
Mhm.
Some people call it speech dominant. But yeah, the sound that I'm speaking in right now versus this one.
Yeah. And you did mention a few similarities. Are there other similarities between the male and female voice that you would want to mention?
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that both men and women belt. Some people have a hard time calling what men do at the top of the staff belting, and I think it's because it is just a natural extension of most things that we've been doing below.
Mm.
So it doesn't feel like anything new or different. But acoustically and physiologically, men and women enter the belt at around the same point, which is going to be somewhere around F4, G4, somewhere in that area. And we can carry it up almost as high as women, and some men just as high as women. And depending on which acoustic strategy you're utilizing, you may even track identically to a woman. I have up to an open D5, which is the big money note that we ask a lot of women to have. And then I can transition into a closed high belt position above that. Or oftentimes I do it a little bit lower than that because I don't need to do that much work all the time.
Why work that hard if you don't
well,
have
well,
to?
exactly. But yeah, we enter the belt at about the same time, at about the same place, and we can often track in similar ways. Now, men have thicker vocal folds, so there's more of a limiting factor on terms of the top. So that's a big old similarity. Our mode 2 production can actually be quite similar. And depending on who you talk to, the way that countertenors make their sound is going to be very similar to a mezzo in her middle. And I train all of my men to be able to make, even if they're never going to be a commercially viable countertenor, to make large, nice, clean, hooty falsetto sounds that are full. And then we also work much smaller falsetto sounds that might involve a mid to higher larynx position. Same thing with women. So yeah, I think that those things are quite similar. We all access fry, and it's
Hmm.
relatively easy to do that. So there's another small similarity. A lot of what also kind of cemented the similarities between the two were my voice and speech training, because so much of what a lot of what I had to work on was actually lowering my habitual speech pitch. I was too loud, too high, too fast, too
Mhm.
glottally. But a lot of the women I was in class with actually had similar issues. You always hear, "Oh, I need to talk higher because it's going to be healthier." And actually, for a lot of women, they need to release and open and explore that bottom third of their voice, and then that winds up grounding, and they're able to find more buoyancy and depth up top.
Yeah.
So I think that for both men and women, we have to have a foundation at the bottom. Not that we're pressing into it or digging into it, but have access to that low function, so that way we have something to build on.
Hmm.
And then in terms of training agenda, I'm looking for a lot of the same things when I'm training my men and my women. We're looking at legato line. We are looking at ability to release the abdominal wall on inhalation and having a beautifully free rib swing. And we're working on being able to seamlessly move between registers, which is going to be cracky at first. But it is very possible for most any male or female student to go from something head dominant crescendo to something chest dominant and back seamlessly without a big old crack. That can be done, and that's something that I work in pretty much the same range for men and women, much to the chagrin of some of my undergrads because they make big old Tarzan cracks for a while, but but they eventually smooth out.
So I was asked one time about what belting meant to me, and it was in parentheses.
Hmm.
And so I found it very interesting seeing it written that way. And if you look up the term, the Latin term is balteus, meaning sword belt or a girdle. And it was intended to provide support for a weapon. So it's very interesting that we call it belting. Do you know the etymology of vocal belting?
The term started popping up in the mid 40s, or at least that's the earliest that I can see it written.
Mm.
Is I think late 40s, and mostly referring to what Ethel Merman was doing as a way to differentiate the singing that she was doing from the quote legitimate singing
Hmm.
that other people were doing that was more classically oriented, more head dominant. But yeah, it's hard to pinpoint the origin of the sound or of the word for the sound because people have been doing it for thousands of years. If you look at all sorts of world music, that sound is just there.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I hear about it, I think support. So I'm like, oh, that makes me think of the transverse abdominis.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I like the girdle image. I like that the best. Just feel like, oh yeah,
Yeah,
I'm feeling this nice, but because it's really hard to belt if your body's not engaged. So
totally.
think of
Yeah.
there being this belt of support or engagement. I mean, support is a loaded term, but
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the physiology of a healthy belt technique?
absolutely. A lot of people will be afraid of belting. And then when they show me the sound that they're afraid of, I'll say it's not belting. That sound would be something that's incredibly thick mode one, which they're trying to drive up the staff. And there's going to be a limit on that. That sound caps for most people at B flat four, maybe B4. There are some people who can really muscle it out there up to C5, but it's thick, it's loud, it's wide. You're going to see veins popping and people getting red. What we're actually looking for is an ability to thin out the chest voice, thin that TA dominant sound, thin that mode one. And I start working on that around E flat four, between E flat four and G4, because if they can't thin the speech a little bit by then, it's going to be impossible to carry that sound up. So
Mm-hmm.
for me, a healthy belt is going to be thin, balanced mode one. It could be loud or it could be medium loud. It's not always the loudest sound that you've ever heard. And actually, sometimes I'll work with people on a quote quiet belt that has a very similar acoustic profile, but it isn't super loud. And you'll hear some people describe that as having head voice in it. From a laryngeal standpoint, most of the research now is saying that no, that isn't exactly what's happening if you're thinking laryngeal registration. Right now, and this could change tomorrow, but right now, the consensus is that we can't really be in mode 1.5. We're in mode 1 or mode 2, and it's thick or thin. So, what we're trying to do though is borrow a lot of the coordinations that are easier in mode 2 that just naturally happen. So, that's going to be things like laryngeal tilt, thyroid tilt, and being able to feel more of a flexible pharyngeal wall and having more of a sense of ease and flow and the thinning of the vocal folds. And then we bring that over and we blend that or mix that, or what I often like to just call it borrowing. And we put that on light mode one production. And that's how we're able to get that exciting compelling belt sound that carries all the way to the top of the staff and beyond. And then once we're above G5, it might be thin mode one. It could be a really, really pingy mode two. It doesn't really matter because we don't feel the laryngeal registration all that much above there. And then it's really about a sound profile. And that's where a belt can become confusing because belt has could refer to function. Belt can refer to the aesthetic of an entire song, or belt can refer to different acoustic profiles, which there are a whole lot of different definitions, some of which are consistent with the industry and some of which aren't. So we have these fighting definitions of what a belt is.
Can you give us some examples of acoustic profiles? You mentioned that some are consistent with what's happening in the industry and some are not. Can you give us examples of both?
Yeah, so I think the one that's most common in the research is everybody describes belting as tracking your second harmonic. So your fundamental and your harmonic are tracking, second harmonic are tracking really, really well, which gets that quote, that yelly timbre, which is an acoustically viable strategy, but it's not the only one. There are actually plenty of sounds that we perceive as a belt where we are tracking the third harmonic instead, which we also find in classical singing. We allow tenors to have multiple acoustic strategies, but then with belting, there's been this one definition that got put on it. And I think a lot of that came from much of the research focusing solely on belting up to C5, even though we belt way above that.
Mhm.
And probably the most common strategy for up to a C5 is going to be that fundamental to second harmonic tracking. But above that, it's anybody's guess. You could track the second or you could track the third. And both are viable depending on the phrase that we're in, everything that comes before it. If we are buying it as being speech based and it's matching everything that came below. And then that's where we get the interplay of what's going on harmonically and what's going on functionally. So for many women, they'll feel that as an extension of thin chest. Other people will feel like, oh no, on an F5 or higher, they're in something that's head dominant, but then they're making a specific shape that allows it to still be perceived as a belt. And I think both are viable depending on the voice. So a lot of the issues that I find with acoustic definitions of belting is that they're super, super limiting and saying this is the only thing. But then in research that I did with Amanda Flynn and Aaron Johnson, we found that actually there are a whole lot of sounds that we will accept as being a belted sound.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think there is so much controversy around belting and teaching belt?
I think a lot of it comes from the fact that voice pedagogy is, it's not the oldest field, but it's also not the youngest field. And for so long, it was only looking at Western classical singing, really until the middle of the last century. Not even like the 80s, maybe early 70s, but the Academy had deemed Western classical music as being worthy of study, which limited certainly all popular and contemporary styles, and then musical theater singing as well. And then it wasn't going anywhere, and we started getting more and more academic programs, undergraduate programs first in musical theater performance and singing, and then commercial music performance. And because of that, we needed to have more research. And it was happening on Broadway. So eventually people started to look at it. But even today, I will present at conferences and people will argue with me that what I'm saying is an inherently unhealthy style of singing. Or I loved this question once. Somebody raised their hand and said, so how do you deal with the fact that belting is inherently unhealthy? And I took a second and I blanked a little. I said, well, it's actually not, because there are people who do it well into their 70s who sound amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are people who burn out the same way that there are classical singers who sound amazing in their 30s and 40s and totally burn out. So it's not that the actual style of singing is unhealthy. It's how you go through it and whether or not you're maintaining balance. So because, and doubling back, I think because there are now enough graduate programs that there is more and more research coming out, and there are established pedagogues who have high ranking positions in academic institutions. So they're able to legitimize it now that the academy has been there and said, yes, this is a thing that's worthy of study. I also think part of the problem is so many people aren't trained for it when they're in school for musical theater style singing or any other style that requires belting. And then they try and put classical technique on it, exclusively
Mm-hmm.
classical technique. And by that, I don't even mean, because most great classical teachers still balance head and chest function, but the old school approach of just all head down all the way to the bottom isn't going to serve musical theater. And then people will go and try to belt, and they wind up just doing that shouty thing I was talking about earlier, and they wind up hurting themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So unhealthy singing is unhealthy singing, regardless of the style. And I think a lot of people were afraid of it because it was so foreign from how they were trained. And then there are all these myths of Broadway singers and pop singers, or they could totally be true, of getting nodes and their life was over. And it's like, no, no, phonotrauma is a thing, but it goes away and it's not inherent in the style.
Mm-hmm.
It's just part of being unhealthy or just being overworked. In musical theater, we perform 8 shows a week. That's a
Right.
lot.
Plus rehearsals, plus any kind of reading that you're doing, plus all of your PR.
Mhm, absolutely. Well, and if we don't ask opera singers to do that, if we asked opera singers to do Tosca 8 nights a week, yeah, everybody up on that stage would probably have some problems. We wouldn't be able to do that. There's a limit of the genre of singing. So having a realistic expectation of it, of what is needed by the singer, I think is also important.
Yeah. So I've already done an episode with Mary Saunders Barton on cross training.
Oh, great.
And at this point, if the listeners, if you haven't heard it, you can go back and listen to that and hear more about cross training. But do you, Jared, think that someone can sustain a lifelong career as a belter without cross training the voice?
Oh, God, no.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, no. If you're not working that head function, the range of your belt is going to get diminished. The vibrancy and shimmer in your voice is going to go away. You're going to lose that flexibility. It's not working that other side is just a surefire way to limit, like not only limit how long you're going to be able to sing, but limit your expressive palette. And it's not that you have to go and become a world class opera singer, but we just have to be working that opposing muscle group.
Hmm.
Many sopranos find that they'll run into issues as they're aging if they never used any chest voice and they didn't have, and they'll develop a wobble or some intonation issues. And I think that there is a component of actually just building strength via chest voice and grounding the bottom of the voice that gets lost and can cause issues in the other direction.
Yeah. And speaking of the other direction, can you talk to us a little bit about register abuse?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, so if you were to try and make the sound, I mean, I love me some operatic chest voice. You take Marilyn Horne or more contemporary Jamie Barton, and that beautiful open sound that they'll make on an F4, maybe G4. That sound has a cap, and if you try to keep pushing that up, that is too much subglottic pressure. The folds are too thick. They're meeting with too much pressure, and that's going to run you into the ground. The same way that if you try, I do find that women who are trained to quote mask their mix, and by that we mean a head mix, as a belt, can wind up getting into some real problems because they are pinching and nasalizing and doing all sorts of really weird coordinations in order to quote fool us that they're belting, and the industry doesn't buy it. It doesn't really work. And a lot of times you wind up fatiguing very quickly because there's way too much air moving through that thin production and the folds can't handle it. And then women will be like, oh my gosh, why am I getting so tired in my middle? It's like, well, if you would have just balanced your speech and been able to carry up a thin mode one, you probably wouldn't have run into that problem. So yeah, that's kind of the two sides of that. Either being way too thick or way too thin and trying to pretend like you're belting. And I'll hear people, I've heard pedagogues who I just have a different worldview than say, oh my gosh, why would you belt that? Nobody wants to hear it. Just throw it in a head mix. Nobody can tell the difference. Oh, we can tell the difference. We absolutely can tell the difference. And I'm a little bit afraid for what's going to happen.
So, some singers might hear that it's okay to feel vocal fatigue, discomfort, or a bit of hoarseness when they're learning how to belt.
Yeah, I think when there's a singer who's coming at belting who's never ever made a chest voice sound, that thicker sound is going to feel like a lot of pressure. And pressure is okay. And it might feel like they're pushing a little bit. And sometimes I'll say, okay, we need to go through a little bit of a barking phase. But very soon, we are going to lighten that up a little bit. Same way women who've never had any head voice before, I'll say, great, we're going into a drunk owl phase. And they go, whoo, whoo. And I'm like, yes, that is head voice. You're not wrong. But going through that, even when I'm working with somebody who might be a little bit thicker than I ultimately want them to be in the end, because they've never explored that side of their voice, if there's any fatigue that's lasting for more than 2 hours after your voice lesson, probably it wasn't the most coordinated. There might be a little bit of new sensation, so you're feeling some discomfort or what you're perceiving as discomfort, but eventually you get used to what that kind of pressure is. And it's like, oh, okay, great. I can handle this and I can thin it. And it's not going to feel like my head is exploding. You most certainly should never feel like your voice lesson prohibits you from doing your show that night.
Mhm.
It just means that it was probably too thick, too high. And right from the beginning, I'm working with people to balance the top and the bottom. So even if we do have to make big old collie sounds, they're being well produced enough and you're in your body enough that the work is being done in large muscles, large skeletal muscles, and the tiny muscles all around your neck aren't feeling like they have to brace. So I think that there can be toward the beginning a brief phase where it feels like, okay, this isn't what I'm used to, and it's not horribly sustainable. Like, it's not the most sustainable in the world, but it should never feel like, oh my gosh, I'm hurting myself. There shouldn't be pain associated with it. There shouldn't be any hoarseness. Certainly not that proceeds after your voice lesson. You might have, while you're testing your limits, you might have a sound that has a little bit of a scratch, and then we go, okay, great, that was way too much. Let's back up.
Mhm.
But I'm not a big fan of, great, we're just going to yell this out, because that can run you into the ground. But that also comes from, I think that a lot of people who will kind of have that overload approach aren't addressing properly the fact that we need less actual air moving when we're belting because the folds are thicker.
Right.
If you're going to try and move the same amount of air as you would singing a high A5, you're going to run into problems. So that's where there's also, I teach the same kind of release in the abdominal wall, but we do have to learn how to kind of marshal and thin the airstream as we're ascending. And a lot of people who will feel that overload might not be doing that.
Right. Right. And it's remembering that you're learning something new
Yes.
and that anytime we learn something new, we
Mhm.
have to progress into learning it.
Exactly. You're not if you've never belted before, and and it's not even that, but if you're a person who doesn't even really speak in mode 1, because there are people who speak in mode 2,
Mhm.
you may or may not have a balanced belted C in your very first lesson where you try it. But I'll be really thrilled if we can get that A to feel really nice, and then we'll start to move up from there. And it's not that you have to be beyond cautious. It's nothing to be afraid about. It's just knowing, oh right, this is something that we're building up to, and a skilled teacher is going to help you know that. Like, so this is acceptable fatigue that is probably going to go away as soon as we balance you with a little bit of head voice, and then you'll come back and be like, oh right, I feel good as new. And 10 minutes after you make a sound, still feeling like you stripped the gears. Because I've certainly made and actually for me, it wasn't with belting. Belting came pretty easy to me. For me, when I started making classical sounds that would actually carry over an orchestra and were really meaty and exciting, I made some sounds that were too big, and my voice teacher said, okay, we're going to dial that back a little bit. And then there was a period where making those sounds, I was like, okay, great, I've got like 20 minutes in me. And then I feel a little bit of fatigue, and then I'd go away, and then 2 hours later, I could practice again. And then that very rapidly became 40 minutes, and then it was an hour, and then it was me singing my entire recital back to back twice and feeling fresh at the end of it. My entire classical recital that I had to do in graduate school. So, yeah, it's building, and it's trusting that your teacher is guiding you on a path that is going to build that coordination, because it's not like large skeletal muscles. If you're trying to build biceps or your pecs, you're going to get those muscles to hypertrophy. But you don't do that with tiny little intrinsic laryngeal muscles. It's mostly about coordination.
So before we move on to my final questions, because
Mhm.
I have you here, because we've talked about it
Mhm.
before when we're just hanging out and geeking out about the voice,
Uh-huh.
I would love for you to talk to our listeners, especially for the men who might have questions about falsetto.
Yeah. I love falsetto. I do a whole lot of falsetto work, even for my men who are never ever going to do it in public, and also never say never,
True.
um, because there's so much cool music being written, both musical theater stuff and pop, and even some like for effect in opera. Like, use your falsetto. A lot of men will come to me and say that they don't have access to their falsetto, or that they just don't have a falsetto. And I'm like, oh, no, you do. You do. Worst case scenario is there's some kind of pathology in the way, and then we're going to go to the laryngologist and the speech path, and we're going to learn how to work around it. But every healthy man can get into their mode 2 production. And for if you want to do high belt, it's essential, because it's one of the best ways to extend the range on that belt is to use the thinning function of falsetto, and to use that tilting of the larynx to help depressurize and thin the fold so we don't carry up too much thickness. Because I can be a whole lot thicker on a G if I choose to than I'm going to be on a B. So with men in falsetto, I begin by trying to get them to make just small little chirpy sounds. I don't even think of sustaining long phrases or anything like that. I just try to get them to be able to make something like ooh, ooh, ooh. Just easy. And if that's too high, then we do it lower. Ooh, ooh. Or we whimper with our mouth closed like a sad puppy. And then for some men, if the neck muscles are really, really tight, if the suprahyoids are way over clenched, if your sternocleidomastoid is overengaged, or just for whatever reason you have limited mobility on the cricothyroid joint, then we might start on the opposite end with a super airy but still falsetto production of whoo, and that's the drunk owl. It's definitely falsetto. um, we work to get that to be sustainable, and we work to get that to be a clean sound. One of my first objectives with my men is to try and get that nice, small, but very clean, whimpery to be second nature. And from there, we can explore range, and we can start to explore opening up the pharyngeal wall a little bit more. We can explore lowering the larynx and finding more of a hooty countertenory sound, but all from a place of closure where where the folds are coming together all the way and there's not extra noise in the sound. A lot of men will also just say, oh, my falsetto has always been airy. And it might have always been airy, but we can find ways to get it to be clear, because then that function is going to more easily be borrowed when we go into high belt, and we bring up a thin mode one. I also do a lot of work going from falsetto to chest. And at first, there are big, really gross yodels, and we just embrace them. They're there. I make them. My students are going to make them. So it might be something like, ooh, ah, with that big old crack in the middle, but eventually they can go, ooh. Hopefully, that is going to be seamless and going in either direction. Yeah, and getting those falsetto sounds to be clear. Also, a lot of times they'll do really wonky things with their tongue. So making sure that we can make those clean sounds with a tongue that's resting in the front part of their mouth, not pulling back like crazy to try and stabilize or anything like that. And then making sure that you can go from falsetto into a chest dominant production, but maintain the same exact shape and the same feeling of ease and flow, which is a way to kind of get the middle and bottom middle of the voice to not feel as thick, because a lot of guys will be too heavy on the bottom and then wonder why they can't get above a G. But if there's too much weight around E flat 3 and G3, then E flat 4 and G4 are going to have a lot harder time coming out in a clear, easy bell. And then if you want to go above that, forget about it. But a lot of that comes from balancing the falsetto. And then we can also play around with Frankie Valli style falsetto mixy things, or adding some nasality or a whole lot of twang to that. And then we can also, if we get really, really high thin falsetto going, chances are you can probably get a cool Queen style, Adam Lambert style high scream going, which is a really fun sound to make. It's a cool sensation, and it honestly doesn't feel like a lot of work once that coordination is in place. But I've yet to meet somebody who can do that really well, who doesn't have masterful control over their falsetto.
Someone like Pavarotti singing Nessun Dorma and he's up on the high C.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a full mode one?
Yeah. Yep. That's why it's so hard. Classical tenor. Classical tenor. People will disagree with me, particularly if they're another voice part, but hardest thing to do because it's so much fold thickness. And there's something that happened, but that's why it was so exciting when it started to happen, where men were in this chest dominant production. And yes, they've turned the vowel, and some men will call that head voice because they feel there's an acoustic shift that happened that has proprioceptive changes associated with it. But that is absolutely not a falsetto, and you can do the test. If you have that sound and you decrescendo it and it feels like there's a crack, or you're having to very much negotiate a crack, it was not falsetto. Now, there are some cool sounds that you would make in other repertoire where you would have a really beautifully balanced falsetto sound, but that wouldn't cut in the same way that a Pavarotti high C would. Which is why it takes so long to develop that, and why the training of an elite classical voice takes such a long time, and we're building stability and stamina and really being careful with what shapes we're making. Because if we spread too much, then it's going to belt out. And when I'm belting a C versus when I'm singing a classical high C, my belted C is so much less pressurized. It's definitely thin mode one, but it's way thinner than the classical version would be. And my vowel is wider. My larynx is a little bit higher. Also, people are terrified of the high larynx. As long as it can relax back down, we're okay. I don't want it to be up behind my orbital socket, but
it's all about range of motion.
It's all about range
Keeping
of motion.
the range of motion.
And I have a flippity floppity larynx that likes to yo-yo, which is why belting was so easy for me to figure out. But yeah, that the top of my classical range is there is more subglottic pressure. There is my body. I'm always working and I sing with my whole body, but if I'm not bringing a lot of energy, physical energy to that, it's just going to crack out. So yeah, no, that's not a reinforced falsetto.
Yeah. So amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's so thrilling when people do that. And then there are some I love the female belters who wind up tracking similarly to classical men, which is another viable option, which is why we're talking about different acoustic profiles.
Can you give us examples of that?
Yeah,
Like who?
Carolee Carmelo, Donna Murphy, sometimes Kate Baldwin. She does both. I mean, they all kind of do both, but sometimes they'll turn they'll turn that vowel similarly to a tenor as early as B flat sometimes, and then they just travel on up, and it's so thrilling and really really cool. The one of the best examples that I'll use for my students to hear that is there's a video of Kate Baldwin singing New York, New York, and you can hear how she tracks up and she turns that vowel in the same way that a tenor will. And that's just it's such a thrilling sound.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to my questions that I ask every interviewee.
Ooh.
The first is, what is some advice that you would want to give to an aspiring performer?
Advice that I want to give to an aspiring performer. You know what? It could just be because right now my Boko kids are all so stressed and being hard on themselves. Everybody's struggling with something, even the
Mm.
people who make it look super easy. And if they're making it look super easy, it probably means that they either did a whole lot of work at home and are just doing their darndest to project confidence, or you know what, they might just not really care, and that's not going to get them very far. So everybody's struggling with it, and just keep finding the joy and the love in it. It's always really sad to me when somebody comes to a voice lesson from wherever they're coming to me from, and I ask them what songs they love to sing, because I ask everybody in a first lesson. I ask them what they love about their voice, what their favorite musicals are, who their favorite singers are, and what their favorite songs to sing are, including shower songs, not just book songs. And some people have a really, really hard time with that. And constantly remind yourself to find the joy and to remember that you're so lucky to be doing what you're doing. And whether or not you want to be a professional doing this, or you love to do this and it's your hobby and it's your avocation, always make it be joyful. I mean, it's not always going to be joyful. If I'm sitting there in a voice lesson and I'm having a hard time with the coordination, there might be some consternation. But I come back to the joy later. So yeah, I think because my Boko kiddos were stressed out with midterms and recital and getting into spring break, I'm wanting everybody to remember that it's joyful and it's meant to be joyful. And if it stops being, take a second and slow down and find what sparked your interest and your love for it at the beginning. The other thing that I would say is just learn how to make the practice room playtime, because being in the studio with a voice teacher for an hour a week is really amazing, but we can't control the other 6 days and 23 hours that you have your voice. And most of the really great learning and teaching is going to be self-teaching by playing in the practice room and finding a sense of spontaneity and taking what you did with your teacher and trying something out. And you're going to find your limits that way. And sometimes you're going to have a swing and a miss, but that's okay. So find the joy in some way of finding joy in the practice room.
What has been your greatest professional achievement?
Oh, my greatest professional achievement. I mean, I've there have been so many things that have made me feel so blessed. The biggest turning point was me getting into the Penn State program, because Mary and Raymond Sage and Dr. Spivey and Dr. Bev and all the other teachers that I had there changed the trajectory of my life and the kind of teacher that I am. But then moving to New York and the fact that people actually want to come and study with me, and that people who are on Broadway and doing national tours and who are elite level opera singers who are wanting to cross over are trusting me with their voices is really amazing. And then getting the job at the Boston Conservatory just makes me, I'm so lucky that I get to work with colleagues of a really high caliber and with students who are amazing and dedicated. And then I've gotten to speak at a lot of conferences, which also always just people want to hear what I have to say, and sometimes they fight with me, and that's really cool. Let's have a conversation about it. And then the getting published in the Journal of Voice with Amanda and Aaron was really huge, and the two of them, they inspire me to keep working and to keep being a better researcher and a better teacher. So yeah, that was a really long answer to what could have been a short question, but I feel like I'm so lucky to have the best job in the world.
And what has been your greatest professional setback?
Oh gosh, my greatest professional setback. There have been grants that I've applied for that I haven't gotten. There have been fellowships that I've applied for. There have been programs that I've applied for that I haven't gotten. And those always fuel the like, oh, someone's going to find me out, or they found me out, and I'm a charlatan and I don't know what I'm doing, and I should probably go pack up and do something else.
Imposter syndrome?
Oh, huge imposter syndrome, huge imposter syndrome. So things like that. And I also think I wouldn't necessarily call this a setback. No, I mean, it felt like a setback at the time. My first year of graduate school, completely changing my mentality of what it meant to be a student and taking myself seriously in order to be the model that we had there is that of a teaching artist, which meant that I had to be an artist of very high caliber and learning to take myself seriously as an artist and do the level of work that they were expecting of their graduates was a lot. The learning curve on that was huge because I sight read to 85% really, really well, and getting that extra 15% took a lot. And it meant some real hard heart to hearts with all of my faculty. Actually, I'm not all of them, but in multiple settings where it was like, nope, the work that you're doing, yes, you know all the voice science, yes, you know the anatomy and physiology. It's so great that you want to help a whole lot of other people, but you need to spend the time on you because right now you can't empathize with your students who are performing at the highest level. So we had some really hard conversations about that where I had to relearn how to be in the practice room and relearn. I don't know. It was people talk about vocal identity crises, and for me, it was just a crisis of no, I'm just a teacher. I'm just a teacher, and becoming the artist part of a teaching artist was hard, and it was yeah, it was a hard fought battle. But I do remember the turning point in my second year, and it feels like it was graduate school part one, graduate school part two, and I came around the corner because they were supportive, and it was all coming from a place of seeing my potential and knowing that I could. But yeah, I had to have people who cared enough to tell me when I wasn't doing the work.
Mm, yeah.
So that would be the biggest like that and like the things that I've applied for and not gotten, which always just sucks a little bit.
Yeah. What do you wish that you would have learned sooner?
What do I wish that I would have learned sooner? I wish that I would have learned sooner that there isn't only one recipe for success. And there isn't only one way to approach singing. And I mean, I knew this in a lot of ways because I remember my personal statement years ago for teaching was that you do whatever the student needs. But then that was more in terms of like methodology and all that kind of stuff. But then realizing, you know what? No, it's okay to have a different paradigm that we're working from, and that doesn't diminish the way that I teach or the what I think about the voice. We can look at it differently, and we don't have to get into a. It's not a life or death scenario, and that actually I'll be a better teacher if we have a real conversation about it, rather than me shutting down because it's information that I didn't have.
Mhm.
Sometimes it feels like when you hear something that's different from the way that you think about it or the way that you've been taught to think about it, you shut down around it. And learning to embrace that earlier would have been great. That and being I wish I would have learned earlier that there's no such thing as quote being wired as an actor and quote being not wired as an actor. Uh, yeah, I got told in high school I was like 14 years old, but got told, "Oh my gosh, you sing so pretty, but boy, you can't act." And that stuck with me for a long time until my mid 20s, and then I owned myself and that my singing got so much better because I thought I could just make it devoid of acting. You can sing my numbers, you can totally do, if you do X, Y, and Z, that will happen. But then when you bring the humanity aspect, it gets so much better. So I wish that I had learned that there's no such thing as somebody who isn't wired as an actor.
Mm,
There's just different ways in.
right.
I wish I would have learned that earlier. Would have saved me a whole lot of self angst.
So if any of the listeners would like to learn more about you, Jared, or contact you, what is the best way to do that?
You can head on over to my website, jaredtrudeau.com, and there's a contact me form on there that will go right to my email, or you can just email me at jared@jaredtrudeau.com. Not Justin, I'm not the Prime Minister of Canada, even though I get emails literally probably every other day. Dear Justin. You could do that. I mean, my Instagram profile is public. I don't do very much on there, but every once in a while I'll put something voice related on there. You can also find me if you search my name under the Boston Conservatory faculty directory. You can find me there. And yeah, and on my website, I generally will have whatever master classes I'm doing or if I'm presenting in different places. You can find out more information there.
Great. Amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today about the differences of the male and female voice and about belting and the physiology of healthy belting. It has been awesome talking to you, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please tell your colleagues, your students, and your friends. Please subscribe, rate us, and write a review. You can find us on Facebook at Lifelight Massage, and you can also check out my website at lifelightmassage.com. Please join me next week for another wonderful conversation on the visceral voice.